Stacey Castor was born in the summer of 1967 and lived a mostly normal life. In 1985, at the age of 17, Castor met a boy, Michael Wallace, and immediately fell in love. 3 years after that initial meeting, the pair would marry and have their first daughter, Ashley. 3 years later, the couple would continue to grow their family and welcome their second child, another daughter named Bree. The family had little money, but managed to make ends meet over the preceding years. But as the world celebrated the turn of the millennium, and under the fear of Y2K in 1999, Castor's life would take a turn that would lead to 2 husbands being dead and a child close to it. This is the story of Stacey Castor and the case of the Black Widow killer. By 1999, the family and life that Castor and Wallace had built was beginning to fall apart. Castor spent her days working as an ambulance dispatcher, while her husband worked nights as a mechanic. The family wasn't poor, but they did live paycheck to paycheck throughout most of the 1990s. During that time, Wallace and Castor favored separate children, with Wallace becoming very close to Bree, and Castor lavishing attention onto Ashley in an attempt to balance out the love in the family. But despite how close both were with their specific children, the couple managed to grow apart, and rumors floated that both Castor and Wallace were engaged in their own extramarital affairs. At the end of 1999, as the world was captivated by Y2K and the turn of the millennium, things took the first drastic turn in the lives of the family. During the end of that year, Wallace's health had begun to take a turn for the worse at a very rapid pace. Family members took note that Wallace would get desperately ill over the last few weeks of the year and stated that he had become unstable on his feet. He also had serious coughing fits and seemingly looked quite swollen at several points. As noted, these strange symptoms struck Wallace rapidly and seemingly at random, and lasted right through the Christmas holiday. It was then when the family suggested that he see a doctor to see what they could make of the situation, and for him to get some form of treatment. But Wallace would never get the chance to see a doctor, and would pass in early 2000. What makes this worse is the fact that daughter Ashley, 11 at the time, was alone with her father at the time that he passed away. Ashley would never quite live down this traumatic moment in her life, and noted that she saw her father being very ill throughout the day, but didn't think much of it. This because he was already having various health issues, and because she was far too young to truly understand the severity of the situation. After the coroner inspected the body, they found nothing out of the ordinary, and listed the cause of death as a heart attack. Wallace's sister, though, didn't think that was the case because of his sudden symptoms preceding his death, and the fact that Wallace was a fairly healthy person before his sudden turn. She would push for an autopsy, to find out for sure. But Castor would deny an autopsy and would side with the initial report that her husband had simply died of a heart attack. Castor would then move on with her life, and by 2003 would remarry. But fate, or perhaps something more malicious, would enter the picture in 2005, when Castor would call the police to tell them that her new husband had managed to lock himself inside their bedroom after a particularly heated argument, and had refused to answer his cell phone or talk to her through the door. She noted that her husband had been locked away for the better part of a day when she called the police in a worried state after he didn't head to work in the shared workspace that they had in the home. Police would arrive on the scene in short order, and they would get no response from inside the room. So they kicked the door down, only to find her husband laying dead with a can of antifreeze nearby and a glass full of a bright green liquid on a table. Another husband was dead in mysterious circumstances, but another coroner report would state that this time her husband had committed suicide via ingesting antifreeze. But what made this instance different was that police were involved, and because of the death, began an investigation. And quickly, concerns would arise when police found Stacey Castor's fingerprints on the glass of antifreeze and recovered a turkey baster with her husband's DNA on the tip. This tipped off police that Mrs. Castor may have had some sort of involvement in the murder, as it would be odd to have a turkey baster used when her husband already had a glass in hand. Investigators would eventually formulate a theory that Castor had somehow planned and carried out the murder of her husband by using the turkey baster to force-feed her husband after he was in a weakened state from the initial antifreeze poisoning, in an attempt to make sure he would die. Police now had a theory, but little to build an actual case on, and so decided to monitor Castor and wiretap her home in an attempt to see if she would slip up and reveal what she had done to someone. They also monitored the grave sites of both of her husbands, who she had buried side by side, but she never visited the graves of either after the murder. Police didn't turn up anything, but felt that Castor was involved in the death of at least her most recent husband, and managed to get permission to exhume the body of her first husband, who didn't have an autopsy, so they could run one, as well as a toxicology screening. This plan paid off, as an autopsy on her first husband found traces of antifreeze in his system, with the final result being that he was poisoned slowly through being somehow fed antifreeze. This result helped to explain Wallace's symptoms in the few short weeks of his random and violent sickness. Castor did her best to live her life and stay quiet, but she began to panic when she found out that police had exhumed her first husband and found traces of antifreeze in his system. So she then devised a way out by trying to set up her daughter Ashley for both of the murders. Castor would carry out this plan on Ashley's first day of college. It was during that day that detectives went to visit Ashley alone and inform her about the fact that her biological father, Wallace, had been poisoned and did not die from a heart attack, as she had been told. This revelation stunned Ashley, which led her to frantically call her mother to inquire about what was happening. Castor then invited Ashley home that night for a chance to talk about it over a few drinks, citing that they were both stressed out and needed to relax. If you'll recall, Castor had become Ashley's best friend as the pair were incredibly close, thanks in part to her father's love of her sister over her. Ashley agreed and seemingly had a normal night of drinking with her best friend, mother. After that night, Castor would invite Ashley to drink away their troubles the following night, to which Ashley obliged. But this is when Castor initiated her plan to frame her daughter for both murders. During the next evening, Castor offered her daughter Ashley what she called a nasty tasting drink that she didn't initially want to have, but eventually relented because she trusted her mother and already had one fun night without any issues. This would be a nearly fatal mistake, as Ashley quickly fell into a comatose state and was placed into her bed at her mother's home. She laid there for almost 20 hours in a near-death state before eventually being found by her younger sister Bree. Not only did her sister find her near death, but she also discovered a suicide note lying next to Ashley, seemingly admitting to killing her father at age 11, and then her stepfather years later. Miraculously, paramedics arrived in time to save Ashley, noting that if they had gotten there any later, Ashley would most certainly be dead. Ashley would eventually wake from her coma and be immediately questioned by police. She told them that the last thing she remembered was her mom pressuring her to drink a mixed drink that she made special for her, noting that her mother never made her an alcoholic beverage before in her life. Ashley was also confused about the entire situation and made it clear that she did not write the suicide note that her mother had made sure to hand over to paramedics before being taken to the hospital. Police also informed Ashley that doctors had found a near-fatal level of painkillers in her system. Castor would eventually be arrested, thanks in part to the failed murder attempt against Ashley that only added to the case that police had been building against her over the years. She was charged with second-degree murder and the death of her most recent husband, and with attempted murder of her daughter. During the eventual trial, Ashley's suicide note would be brought into evidence, where the prosecution claimed that the computer-written note had been typed and printed by Castor. They noted that the suicide note didn't make sense, and Ashley's fingerprints were never found on anything associated with any of the deaths. They pointed out the evidence of antifreeze poisoning and how it affects the body, specifically the growth of certain crystals in the kidneys, these crystals being found in both of her husband's bodies. Another damning piece of evidence was the fact that detectives found a number of rough drafts saved automatically that Castor was almost certainly not aware of. They argued that this showed that Castor had planned out the murder attempt, and paired this with Ashley's testimony, where she said her mother had forced her to drink a strange, mixed drink. Castor's defense would try to poke holes in Ashley's testimony, and even went as far as suggesting that Ashley might be mentally ill. They also tried to explain just how an 11-year-old girl could slowly kill her father because of the love he showered on her sister instead of her. Shockingly, her defense introduced Ashley's grandmother, Castor's mother, who stated that she believed her granddaughter was guilty of the crimes. But the prosecution would hold strong, and upon their cross-examination of Castor, poked enough holes in her story to convince the jury of her guilt. Most notably, the prosecution noted that Castor never sought therapy for Ashley after seeing her father die, or offer it when her stepfather died in similar circumstances. They also leaned heavily on the fact that Castor never once sought help for her daughter Ashley in the 17+ hours she was inside her home in a comatose state. They questioned how a woman who had lost 2 husbands to sudden deaths would not seek immediate help for her daughter suffering from similar ailments. Even with Castor taking the stand, and the defense presenting a few experts to try to explain away the painkillers found in Ashley's system, the jury returned a guilty verdict for second-degree murder for the death of her husband, and attempted second-degree murder in the forced overdosing of her daughter. The judge would hand down the maximum sentence, during which he noted how Castor had continued to party in the backyard while her daughter was lying comatose, slowly dying a room away. He stated of Castor that she is cold, calculating, and without emotion for what she has done. He also added extra time to her sentence because she had forged her most recent husband's will in order to leave out his son from receiving anything. For her part, Stacey, the Black Widow Castor, will serve 51 years to life in prison, with her first chance of parole coming in 2060. But Castor would never get the chance for a parole hearing, as she died in prison on June 11th of 2016 at the age of 48.